I'm Amelia, about to turn 27 this year. I've been happily married for 5 years, and my son Martin just celebrated his 4th birthday. I used to work full-time after we got married, but now I balance part-time work at the same company. My husband Brian is 33 years older than me. Brian's initial enthusiasm in our dating days was exciting, but after we got married, his behavior changed. He became more domineering. Brian has a 20-year-old sister named Jane, and their age difference seems to make Brian more indulgent with her. Before we were married, I didn't mind Jane's frequent visits. I assumed they had a close relationship. But after we tied the knot, I noticed Jane's behavior shift. She often drops by unannounced, expecting to be served without bringing anything to show her appreciation. Brian, instead of addressing this, expects me to cater to her demands. Jane treats me like I'm invisible, only speaking to Brian. Despite not preparing for an extra guest, I end up serving dinner to Jane. Brian, rather than understanding, blames me for not being more considerate. Even when Jane apologizes, it's clear she enjoys the preferential treatment Brian gives her. Left with leftovers, I make my own meal while Brian and Jane chat on the sofa, leaving the dining table a mess. They treat Martin and me more like hired help than family. One evening, as I'm about to bathe Martin, Brian interrupts loudly, demanding I buy a cake for Jane despite the late hour. Jane insists on having it right away, and Brian blames me for the delay. Feeling pressured, I reluctantly take Martin to the cake shop. Overhearing their conversation, I learn they're criticizing me and questioning why Brian married me. Martin, though too young to understand the words, senses the tension. I try to hide my frustration and ask him about his cake preference. He cheerfully requests one with lots of fruit. Our trip to the cake shop was filled with discussions about cakes, momentarily distracting me from Brian's harsh words. Martin and I arrived just before closing time. Fortunately, we found the cake Jane desired, so we purchased 2 cakes, including the fruit-loaded one Martin wanted. Back home, I served the cakes to Jane and Brian, then prepared Martin's cake and headed to the dining room. The moment I placed it in front of Martin, Jane pointed and expressed her desire for that cake. Before I could react, Brian moved Martin's chosen cake in front of Jane, disregarding Martin's protests. Brian justified his action, claiming he bought the cake with his earnings and had the right to choose for Martin. Unable to contain my emotions any longer, I voiced my dissatisfaction. In response, Brian threatened with divorce. Martin, who had stopped crying, anxiously held my hand and then, after some thought, said, "Mom, I also love cake with strawberries on it. Yes, it's really delicious." He mentioned this while eating the cake initially wanted by Jane. Feeling that Martin was enduring too much, I lifted his cake plate. When I saw Jane reaching for it, I took Martin to the next room so he could enjoy his cake in peace. Brian apologized to Jane, claiming he was sorry for being stingy. Despite wanting to retort, I held back for Martin's sake. Watching Martin innocently enjoy his cake was a heartwarming sight. After finishing the cake, we decided to have a late bath and sleep in Martin's bed. The next morning, I discovered Jane had already left. As I prepared breakfast, I heard Martin crying. Shockingly, his piggy bank, a gift from my father, was broken and the saved money was gone. Martin, who always said goodnight to the piggy bank, was left heartbroken. When I questioned Brian about it, he casually mentioned that Jane needed some money, so she took it from the piggy bank. Holding a crying and shaking Martin, I felt his pain so acutely that I cried with him. It was painful to witness Brian prioritizing and caring for his sister more than our son. Expressing my anger and sadness, I confronted Brian, breaking my usual silence on arguments in front of Martin. Brian, without a word, went to the bedroom and returned with something shocking in hand: divorce papers. I discovered the hidden divorce papers that Brian had tucked away somewhere I didn't know. In a sudden burst, he confronted me, shoving the papers at me before storming out of the house with a loud bang. Martin, who had never cried over the issues with Brian and Jane, seemed to have reached his limit, crying since last night. Unable to bear seeing Martin so hurt, I suggested skipping daycare for the day, and he happily agreed with a loud yes, showing a faint smile. We spent the day playing and bonding, with Martin bringing a picture book from the shelf, sitting on my lap, and happily remarking, "The teacher at the nursery today was Mama, right? He looks like an angel." His little heart seemed filled with patience, and I decided to make the day special by taking a day off from work. Despite causing potential trouble at my workplace, they kindly understood the situation and granted me a day off. In the morning, we visited the park, played hide and seek, and had fun in the sandbox and on the slide. When we returned home for lunch, Martin appeared sleepy, usually napping by himself, but today he fell asleep on my lap, like when he was a baby. Though I initially thought of doing household chores during his nap, I decided that today was special. Instead, I allowed myself to be healed by his peaceful sleeping face and gentle breathing. However, my serene moment was abruptly interrupted by a noise from the entrance, indicating the front door had opened. As it wasn't Brian's usual time to come home, I became suspicious and quickly hid in the bedroom closet, clutching Martin. A voice echoed through the house, and to my surprise, it was Jane. Trembling with fear, I listened as she searched for something, expressing frustration over not finding it. Jane then made a phone call, mentioning Brian and discussing their unsuccessful search. After hearing her lock the front door and leave, I put Martin to bed and contemplated the strange events. I couldn't comprehend why Jane had entered the house and what they were looking for. Suddenly, Brian seemed like a stranger, and I felt a mix of disgust and fear towards him. Swiftly packing essentials for Martin and myself, we headed to the station and took a train to my parents' house. Fortunately, their home was nearby, just 2 stations away. Although I hadn't contacted them beforehand, my parents sensed something from my expression and welcomed us without asking questions. I shared the entire ordeal with them, including my fear of staying at our house due to Brian and Jane's actions. Upon hearing my mother's suggestion that Jane might have been looking for my belongings, possibly cash or cards, I recalled my past experience as a successful CEO in the handmade goods industry. I had entrusted the company to friends when I decided to prioritize raising my child after getting married. Although I still worked part-time and communicated with the company from home, Brian was unaware that I was still the CEO. I discovered the hidden divorce papers that Brian had tucked away, suspecting that he thought I had a decent amount of savings. While I've mentioned to him that I still receive some assistance from the company, I've deliberately kept the details about being the CEO and my savings private. This secrecy stems from realizing early in our marriage that Brian struggles with managing money and tends to spend everything he earns. Kevin, at first, provided only $200 a month for food expenses and even suggested I quit my job to become a full-time housewife. However, with the financial strain of raising Martin and only $200 for food, I never agreed to be a full-time housewife. Eventually, he reluctantly allowed me to work part-time. To ensure I wouldn't consider divorce, he had me sign a postmarital property waiver through a lawyer. Since Martin's birth, I used my savings for his nursery fees and clothes. Since I've only received $200 for food, I've never asked Brian for additional funds beyond the food budget, leading him to believe I have savings. Considering Jane's apparent need for money and Brian's perception of my financial situation, they might be searching for my cash cards. I have a separate savings account dedicated to Martin with a portion of my salary directly deposited into it each month. Despite their search, they won't find the cash cards as I always carry my valuables. However, there's still an unsettling issue. Jane might be entering our house even when we're not there, and Brian may be allowing it. Following my father's advice, I decided to store my valuables, including the cash cards, in my parents' safe. As I pondered their need for money, Martin approached my father, crying over his broken piggy bank and the shattered promise of saving up. My father, angered by Martin's story, vowed to call Kevin. My mother suggested finding out their purpose calmly, as Brian's mention of divorce might shift blame to us, making the divorce more favorable for him. To ascertain their purpose, I decided to record their conversation, consulting a lawyer who was a friend of my father's. Returning home, I began cooking dinner, keeping my phone screen down to record secretly. Brian arrived home, surprising me by immediately asking about my cash cards. When I questioned him, he gave vague answers, attempting to deceive me. When I remained silent, Brian grew agitated and demanded all my part-time money for his sister. Refusing, I explained it was for Martin's savings. In response, he angrily pushed the signed divorce papers toward me, declaring that I was living off his money and didn't need to save for Martin. He even uttered words implying he valued Jane more than our son. Hearing this, I stopped preparing the meal, put the divorce papers in my bag, took Martin's hand, and headed for the door. Kevin, in a loud voice, declared his serious intent for divorce, instructing me never to come back. I responded by stating I wouldn't return to a house where a stranger could come and go freely. After leaving, I received numerous messages and calls from Kevin, which I ignored. Turning off my phone, I sought refuge at my parents' house, sharing the recording and divorce papers with them. Although I confessed to having no love or affection for Kevin, I expressed concern for Martin. My parents advised me to do as I pleased, acknowledging the potential emotional impact on Martin if a divorce were to occur. While grappling with the decision to divorce Kevin, Martin expressed his hunger. My mother, seeing my distress, kindly made him hamburgers, his favorite dish. Overwhelmed with emotions, tears welled up in my eyes as my mother told Martin, with a warm smile, that she prepared the hamburgers so that he and I could visit whenever we wanted. Taking a bite, Martin exclaimed with joy, praising Gran's hamburgers and expressing a desire to eat them every day. I responded, saying it's because the hamburger contains the love I have for him. In a touching gesture, he took a big bite and offered it to me. Moved by Martin's kindness, my tears couldn't be held back, and even though I tried to stop them, they persisted. My father, noticing Martin's concern, reassured him that my tears were of happiness, not sadness. Hearing this, Martin, in a moment of understanding, hugged me, and my father's eyes turned bright red, realizing the blessing of being with family. I remarked to Martin that family is precious. Surprised, he questioned if Dad had mentioned that only Jane was family. My father gently confirmed it, but then asked Martin if he wanted to live with them as family. With a laugh, Martin happily agreed, making everyone smile. Naturally, despite contemplating divorce, the meal felt so happy that I finally decided to part ways with Kevin. I planned to inform Martin about it, and even though discussing it weighed heavily on my heart, Martin seemed to grasp the situation happily. He expressed the desire to live as a family, embracing the pet dog and calling him his younger brother, despite the dog being older. Preparations for the divorce began, starting with contacting a lawyer who was a friend of my father. The next day, we formalized the contract, and my father and Martin shared comforting laughter while I lay in bed reminiscing about my childhood. The following day, upon checking my smartphone, I found over 200 calls and messages from Kevin, showcasing his emotional instability. Exhausted, I turned off my phone and, with the lawyer's assistance, explained the situation to my parents. Jane had accumulated significant debt from a casino and shopping addiction, and Brian acted as her guarantor, planning to use my savings. The lawyer confirmed that the divorce papers had already been submitted, and Brian sobbed upon realizing it was finalized. Despite expecting disagreements about child support, he signed a pledge to pay $340 to Martin every month. In a subsequent call from Kevin, his tone lacked aggression, and he calmly admitted to financial manipulation and explained his complex feelings toward Jane. I firmly asserted my decision not to reconsider and heard his faint sobbing before he wished me happiness and hung up. Remaining strong until the end, I discussed future plans with my parents and decided to stay with them until Martin grows up. I resumed my role as a company president and later learned that Brian and Jane had informed their parents about the divorce and debt, resulting in disownment. Today, I find happiness